friends. Today's lesson is Lesson 2 in our CKLA domain, Presidents and United States Symbols. The lesson is A Dishonest Story About an Honest Man. In today's read aloud, we're going to talk about Washington, D.C., and we're also going to describe important characteristics of the president. So I have a question for you based off of our last read aloud. Who is Washington, D.C. named for? 1, 2, 3. You've got this, George Washington. Remember, a president is the elected or chosen leader of a country. A president has a lot of responsibilities because they help lead the country. We also heard about different monuments of Washington, D.C., and that they were even created to honor past presidents. There are other ways to remember and honor people. For example, you can tell stories about the great things they did. In today's read aloud, we're going to tell about the actions of our first president, George Washington. Our first president had special characteristics or qualities that most good presidents have. One important characteristic of a good president is honesty, which you will hear about a lot in today's read aloud. Almost everyone likes to hear a good story. Some people especially like true stories and tell how real people did real things. Other people say, I love made-up stories the best. A person who tells this kind of story can decide to leave in only the most interesting parts and even make sure there will be a happy ending. However, there is a third kind of story that mixes together true and made-up stories. Today's story is an example of this third type of story and is what we call a legend. It is called A Dishonest Story About an Honest Man. Honest means truthful or trustworthy. This is going to be a story that's not really true about a man who was really truthful. This is a story about George Washington, a real person who acts in the story in an honest way as he often acted in real life. The true part of the story is that George Washington was a real person and he was very honest. The made up part is that he cut down his father's cherry tree. Augustine Washington loved his farm by the river. He loved the rolling green meadows in which he raised horses and other animals. He loved the woods. He loved the rich soil that allowed him to grow plants for food on the farm or to sell in town. He loved the fruit trees on his farm that gave him beautiful flowers in the spring, delicious fruit through the summer and autumn, and graceful shapes to look at in the winter. Augustine especially loved his cherry trees. When his son George was about 5 years old, Augustine said, George, I will teach you which sorts of cherry trees grow best and how to take care of them so they will grow tall and strong and give delicious fruit. Were Augustine's trees important to him? Yeah, how do we tell? That's right, because he would love that the rich soil for them that he grew on his farm. He talked to his son about raising them. So you can imagine how upset Augustine was to find one day that someone had chopped down one of his prized trees. This particular day, he was walking with his foreman, a man who worked for him and helped run his farm. Augustine said, this was no accident. Someone did it on purpose. Look how neat of a cutting job this was. No wild animal could have done that. Who would do such a thing? His foreman replied, I just can't imagine who would have the nerve to do it, sir, or the reason. Who do you think cut down the cherry tree? Caught up in their conversation, the two men did not notice little George Washington approaching from the house. The boys silently listened to the two grown-ups. Where is George hiding in this picture? Yeah. He looked at his father and saw disappointment and anger. George stepped forward, looking pale and worried. To the shock of his father and the foreman, George said quietly but firmly, Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the tree with my little axe. I wanted to see if I could do it, but now I know it was a bad thing to do. Augustine Washington looked at his son. He could see from the expression on his face, or the look on his face, how badly George felt. Meanwhile, the foreman surprised the boys' confession turned back to Augustine Washington. George Washington's confession was that he admitted that he was the one that cut down the tree. He thought, Mr. Washington sometimes has a very bad temper. Poor George, I'd hate to see what's going to happen to him. But to his surprise, he heard the father tell his son, It was a bad thing to do, George, and you should be punished for doing it. However, I so respect you, or admire, or think well of you, for coming forward and telling me the truth, that if you promise not to do such a thing again, I shall not punish you." "I promise, father," said George, and he kept his promise. So you see, even as a young boy, George Washington was honest and took responsibility for his action. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us could be like that? That is a famous legend of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's important to remember that the story about George Washington and the cherry tree is a legend because it's partly true and partly made up. Pause the video and tell somebody close to you what part was made up and what part was true. You might ask, was George Washington really an honest man? Actually, he was. After he grew up and became President of the United States, one of the things for which he was most famous for was his honesty. What's even more interesting is the way in which people looked to the real George Washington. Washington was not perfect. He made mistakes, as everyone does at times. At times, he made decisions with which his friends disagreed. When that happened, they usually said, "We would have chosen differently, but we know he made this choice for a good reason and not just to help himself." Even the King of Great Britain, King George III, admired Washington. Washington had fought against the King of Great Britain's armies for many years and won. That's how the colonies, started by the Pilgrims and others, became the United States of America, a country free from the rule of the King of Great Britain. After King George lost control of the colonies to the people there, who now thought of themselves as Americans, he expected Washington to make himself king of the new nation. Instead, Washington decided to give up control of the army he led and go home to Mount Vernon on his farm in North Virginia. When King George heard of George Washington's plan, he said, "If he can do that, he is the greatest man in the world." George Washington is often described as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. There are many reasons for that. George Washington was the most important leader in winning the war that freed the American colonies from the control of Great Britain and the kings. Washington was one of the most important people involved in setting up the new government and starting a new country in the right direction. He was also the most admired and trusted person in that new country. Today, we still look up to George Washington. In fact, he is considered one of our greatest national heroes. National means having to do with our nation. His face is on the front of the $1 bill and on the front of the quarter. All across America, there are cities, towns, and streets named after him, from Washington, D.C. to the state of Washington. More than 200 years after he died, some people still ask, what would Washington do when making important decisions? George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree, but he left us something that blossoms brightly in all seasons, the example of a brave and honest man. So in today's Read Aloud, we listened to a type of story about George Washington and a tree, cherry tree. Do you remember what that type of story is called? You're right, it's called The Legend. Now, since we're done, I want you to draw or write something about what you learned about George Washington or an example of a time when you were honest. Until next time. Today's word work is about the word respect. Say the word respect with me. 1, 2, 3. Respect. Respect means to admire or think well of someone or something. I respect my friend for being honest, especially when it's easy. The opposite of respect is disrespect, meaning not to admire or think well of somebody. I'm going to read you some examples. If it's an example of respect, you'll say it as a complete sentence. If it is not an example of disrespect, you'll say that that is not an example or that person disrespects someone. All right, here we go. Amelia does not talk back to her parents. Fantastic. You said Amelia respects her parents. Excellent. How about this one? Demetrius trips people on the playground. Excellent. Demetrius disrespects people on the playground. That's the way to do it. Raina took the toy from her sister without asking. If you said, Raina disrespects her sister, you have got your brain in gear today. What about Mitra raised her hand so that she would not interrupt her teacher? Mitra respects her teacher. You've just about mastered this. Last one. Jonathan's uncle felt proud of him when he admitted that he broke the vase. Nice going. Jonathan's uncle respects him. Until next time.